Welcome to Enigma Abierto, where every riddle finds its shadow. Tonight we follow Miss Marple into the hollow Valise, a suitcase light as air, a village heavy with secrets. Where are you listening from? Let us know below. Now, light a candle and let the mystery begin. The garden at Elmstead House had never looked more splendid. Rows of roses, lovingly pruned and coaxed into bloom by Mrs. Mary Edgeworth's dedicated gardener, spilt fragrance into the warm afternoon air. Trellises, heavy with honeysuckle and clematis, framed the stone path, while wicker chairs and lace-covered tables had been set beneath the shade of a copper beech. It was the kind of June afternoon that seemed the very essence of an English village idyll. The air carried the hum of bees and the distant church bells rehearsing for Sunday service. A garden party at Elmstead was no small affair, and half of St. Mary Mead had been invited. There were sponge cakes dusted with sugar, small tarts filled with strawberry jam, and the ever-popular cucumber sandwiches stacked neatly on silver trays. Tea was poured with brisk efficiency by Mrs. Edgeworth's niece, a pale young woman named Clara, while Mrs. Edgeworth herself flitted between groups with a commanding smile, making sure each guest was properly greeted. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, as was her custom, on a sturdy wicker chair near the beech tree. She had been provided with her favorite weak Darjeeling and a thin slice of seed cake. From her position, she could observe, without seeming to, the natural theatre of village society, the self-important vicar's wife, glancing about to ensure her hat attracted attention, the doctor speaking in low tones to a prosperous farmer, young ladies casting sidelong glances at one another's dresses, and, more interesting still, those sudden flickers of tension that passed unnoticed by the general eye. It was during such moments that Miss Marple felt herself both entertained and quietly unsettled. She had long held that the small, seemingly polite world of the English village contained, in essence, the whole of human nature, pettiness, ambition, jealousy, and love, though wrapped in doilies and teacups. The gathering might have passed as entirely unremarkable were it not for the arrival of Mr. Howard Penrith, a tall man of 50 with a distinguished moustache and a reputation for having seen better days. He had only lately returned to the village after a long absence in the colonies. His presence drew whispers. Some recalled debts unsettled years ago. Others speculated about an inheritance squandered abroad. He carried with him, incongruously, a battered leather valise, scuffed and worn at the edges, which he kept clutched by his side even as Mrs. Edgeworth urged him to place it down and partake of the refreshments. "That man's luggage looks as though it has crossed the world a dozen times," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley to Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing. Miss Marple only nodded politely, sipping her tea. She had already noted the curious way in which Mr. Penrith's hand lingered on the handle of the case, as if letting it out of his grasp would cause irreparable loss. The valise hollow, by the sound of it, when he set it briefly on the paving stone, seemed oddly light for something so jealously guarded. The afternoon progressed with the usual mixture of trivial chatter and mild rivalry. Yet beneath the laughter there was an undercurrent of unease. Clara Edgeworth was pale and distracted twice. She spilt tea and once dropped a plate. Mr. Penrith hovered close to her at moments, speaking in low tones that caused her to stiffen. Meanwhile, Mrs. Edgeworth maintained her hostess's smile, but her eyes flicked often toward the valise. It was during the second round of tea that the peace of Elmstead shattered. A sharp cry rang out near the shrubbery, followed by the clatter of porcelain breaking on stone. Guests turned, startled, to see Clara standing rigid, her hands clasped to her mouth. Beside her lay the battered leather valise, flung open as though wrenched apart by unseen hands. Inside was not clothing, nor books, nor the dusty souvenirs of foreign lands. Instead, nestled within a faded lining, was the lifeless body of a small bird, its plumage dull gray, its neck cruelly twisted. The sight was at once pitiful and grotesque. The guests murmured in shock, but before anyone could properly react, Mr. Penrith strode forward, snatched the valise, and snapped it shut. "A foolish prank," he declared, though his voice quavered. "Nothing of concern. Some wretched boys, no doubt. Clara, fetch me a glass of water." But Clara did not move. She stared at him with wide, stricken eyes, and Mrs. Edgeworth hurried forward, pressing a handkerchief into her niece's trembling hand. It was then that something far more dreadful occurred. Mr. Penrith, still clutching the valise, swayed as if overcome by the heat. His lips parted, but no words emerged. He dropped to his knees, the valise tumbling from his hand, and collapsed face forward onto the gravel path. The sudden silence that followed was broken by gasps and cries. Someone exclaimed, "Fetch the doctor!" Though Dr. Hayward was already pressing forward, he bent, checked the pulse, and after a grim moment shook his head. "Dead," he announced quietly. The word rippled through the assembly like a chill wind. Mrs. Edgeworth let out a strangled sob, while Clara gave a faint cry and nearly fainted. Guests drew back, whispering furiously, their tea and cake forgotten. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. Instead, she observed the movements, the glances, the strange relief on one face and the horror on another. These were the small, telling details that meant more to her than any medical pronouncement. At last, she rose, with the assistance of her cane, and stepped closer. The doctor was pronouncing it heart failure, most likely, but Miss Marple had lived too long to accept the obvious without question. She noted the slight blue tinge around the lips, the faint scent one might mistake for almonds that lingered in the air when she bent close. It was the valise, however, that commanded her attention. Hollow, curiously so, and carrying within it not clothes, but a symbolic dead bird. A warning, perhaps, or a message intended for someone present. She glanced up at the gathering of villagers, their faces pale in the dappled light. Already the whispers had begun, and soon suspicion would follow. Miss Marple, appearing merely the concerned old lady with a kind eye for suffering, tucked her hands into her gloves and allowed herself one private thought. Something wicked had settled upon St. Mary Mead once more. The hush that had fallen over the garden was short-lived. Within minutes of Mr. Penrith's collapse, the carefully arranged harmony of Elmstead House gave way to agitation and whispers. Guests spoke in huddles, some pretending to comfort Clara, while others craned their necks to catch every possible detail. Mrs. Edgeworth, pale but still possessed of her hostess's determination, instructed the servants to see to the body until the constable could be summoned. The valise sat closed upon the gravel path where it had fallen. It seemed to radiate an uneasy presence, as though the dead bird within it might take flight at any moment. No one dared touch it. More than one guest cast furtive glances in its direction, murmuring about curses and foreign superstitions. Someone insisted it was a cruel trick, meant to embarrass Penrith. Another suggested it was a warning, though from whom they could not agree. Clara Edgeworth had been led indoors, her arm trembling in her aunt's firm grasp. She looked as though she might faint again at any moment. Some whispered that her distress was nothing more than a display, while others nodded knowingly and said that young women were often more sensitive to such shocks. The truth of her agitation was less easily explained. Dr. Hayward lingered near the body, speaking softly to Constable Turner when he arrived. The doctor's voice was heavy with the authority of a man confident in his judgment. Heart failure, he repeated, brought on by excitement. Perhaps the heat. Nothing unusual in that. But though the constable dutifully wrote it down, there was already a skepticism murmured among the crowd. Mrs. Price Ridley, who considered herself the guardian of propriety in St. Mary Mead, declared to anyone who would listen that Penrith's collapse was the inevitable result of a reckless life. "Mark my words," she said, adjusting her gloves. "A man cannot live abroad for decades without consequence. Some weakness of the constitution, no doubt. I always suspected he had overindulged." Her words were met with nods from some and discreet eye rolls from others. Miss Hartnell, seated uncomfortably on a wicker chair nearby, leaned toward her companion. "It is all rather suspicious, is it not? That dreadful valise and the bird, and then this. Surely the police cannot simply put it down to natural causes." She glanced about, lowering her voice. "And Clara, poor girl, why was he speaking to her in such a manner before it happened? Did you notice her expression?" Her companion shushed her, but the question lingered. Miss Marple, quietly sipping what remained of her cooled tea, heard every word. She made no comment, but her eyes rested thoughtfully on the faces around her. It was remarkable how quickly a village could take a single event and dress it in speculation, fitting motives and explanations as one might patchwork a quilt. She noted Mrs. Edgeworth's protective manner with her niece and the doctor's quickness to dismiss any suggestion of foul play. Most telling of all was the way in which the guests tried to distance themselves from the unsettling sight of death, each finding a way to place the burden of explanation upon another. As the body was carried indoors and the party dissolved into uneasy departure, the conversation spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead. At the butcher's counter that evening, customers whispered over joints of lamb. In the post office, Mrs. Lestrange speculated darkly about the significance of the bird. By nightfall, scarcely a house in the village remained ignorant of the grim events at Elmstead. Each telling grew more elaborate. Some said the bird had been exotic, a parrot or a raven, smuggled from Africa. Others claimed Clara had screamed because she recognized it, though from where they could not say. Theories multiplied: a debt unpaid, a revenge from Penrith's colonial past, a lover's quarrel. What had begun as an afternoon gathering for sponge cake had become the most tantalizing drama St. Mary Mead had seen in years. Miss Marple, however, walked home from the Edgeworths with measured steps, her expression thoughtful beneath her straw hat. She reflected on the look in Clara's eyes when the valise had fallen open, a look of recognition, not mere horror. She reflected, too, on the faint almond scent, the blue tinge about Penrith's lips, details dismissed by the doctor but not lost on her. Death, she knew, often wore the disguise of coincidence. It was human nature, not the heat, that she trusted as the true explanation. When she reached her neat garden gate, Miss Marple paused to admire the roses, their petals faintly glowing in the evening light. The world of blossoms, bees, and quiet paths might seem unchanged, but she knew better. The peace of the village had been disturbed, and such disturbances had a way of uncovering truths long concealed. The next morning promised more questions. Constable Turner would file his report, the inquest would be scheduled, and the gossip would sharpen into accusation. For now, Miss Marple allowed herself a gentle sigh, poured a fresh cup of tea, and considered the simple fact that when human beings lied or schemed, they left traces far subtler than footprints or fingerprints. It was in expressions, in gestures, in the small inconsistencies of behavior that truth revealed itself. And she, more than anyone, had made a quiet art of observing them. The following morning dawned clear and deceptively calm, as though the ordinary order of village life had not been unsettled by the sudden death at Elmstead House. The postman went about his rounds, children hurried to school, and the church bell tolled the quarter hour with its usual reliability. Yet beneath the surface there was a current of unease. Every villager carried a theory, and each was certain theirs was the most credible. Constable Turner, a solid young man with a well-meaning manner, arrived at Elmstead shortly after breakfast to begin his inquiries. He was received by Mrs. Edgeworth, who carried herself with determined dignity despite the obvious strain. Clara remained upstairs, too unwell to appear, and the household servants whispered that she had not touched her breakfast. The constable's questions were straightforward: what had occurred, who had been present, and whether anyone had tampered with the curious valise since the previous day. Mrs. Edgeworth answered carefully, describing the garden party, the sudden collapse, and the doctor's pronunciation. When pressed about the valise, her eyes flickered almost imperceptibly before she assured him that it had been left untouched in her study until the coroner could examine it. Turner dutifully noted her words, though he lacked the instinct to recognize her hesitation. Dr. Hayward, called upon once more, repeated his confident assertion of heart failure. Men of Mr. Penrith's constitution often ignore their health, he said. There was nothing unusual. A weak heart, heat and excitement, that is, the matters concluded. His voice carried the tone of finality, yet Turner could not ignore the persistent whispers among the villagers about poison, about curses, about the sinister bird. Miss Marple, of course, had heard the same whispers. She spent the morning knitting on her cottage veranda, and as often happened, visitors came by with little excuse but to share the latest tidbits. Mrs. Price Ridley stopped first, certain the bird had been meant as a message to Clara, though she could not explain why. Then Miss Hartnell arrived, eager to describe in detail the expression on Penrith's face at the moment of collapse. Each account was embroidered with personal bias, and Miss Marple listened with the serene patience of one accustomed to discerning truth from embellishment. What intrigued her most was not the stories themselves, but what they revealed about the tellers. Each villager, in describing the event, revealed something of their own fears, grudges, or aspirations. It was in these small revelations that the old lady found the material of deduction. By mid-afternoon, Constable Turner himself appeared at Miss Marple's gate, hat in hand, seeking advice under the guise of polite conversation. He knew well enough that the village respected Miss Marple's judgment, though he did not always admit how often her observations had proven correct. "It seems straightforward, ma'am," he said, shifting on his feet. "The doctors set on it being heart failure, and the inquest will likely accept that. Still, folks are uneasy. They talk of the valise and the bird. I'd be obliged for your thoughts." Miss Marple laid down her knitting and regarded him mildly. "It is not unusual for sudden deaths to be attributed to the heart, Constable, and no doubt the good doctor has seen many such cases. But I cannot help noticing details. The faintest scent of almonds, for instance, which one associates not with sponge cake but with certain substances best left in locked cupboards." Turner blinked. "Almonds, ma'am? I confess I did not notice. One would not unless one had the habit of attending to such things," she replied gently. "Nor do I suggest conclusions, only that human beings are rarely as simple as they appear, and what seems natural may be carefully arranged." The constable thanked her politely, though his expression betrayed doubt. Yet her words lodged themselves in his mind, refusing to be dismissed entirely. Later that day, Miss Marple walked to Elmstead House under the pretext of inquiring about Clara's health. Mrs. Edgeworth received her with courtesy, if not warmth, and ushered her into the drawing-room. Clara appeared briefly, her eyes shadowed, her hands restless in her lap. She seemed on the verge of speaking, but at her aunt's glance, she fell silent. "It must have been a dreadful shock," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying sympathy rather than interrogation. "To see such a thing so suddenly." Clara nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. "Yes," she whispered. "I cannot quite rid myself of it." Mrs. Edgeworth interrupted briskly, directing the conversation to more practical matters, but Miss Marple had seen the flicker of recognition in the girl's eyes. Clara knew more than she dared to say. Before leaving, Miss Marple contrived to pass by the study where the valise had been placed. It rested on a side table, its scuffed leather exterior giving no hint of what it had contained. She noted the faint scratches near the lock, as though someone had attempted to open it in haste. Whether those marks were old or recent, she could not tell, but the detail was carefully tucked away in her memory. That evening, the talk in the village grew louder still. At the public house, men speculated about Penrith's financial dealings. It was said he had borrowed heavily before leaving England, and that not all debts had been forgiven. Others insisted he had returned with secrets from abroad, enemies who might wish him silenced. And always the question of the bird returned, like a refrain with no resolution. Miss Marple listened to the rumors without committing herself to any one version. She reflected instead on the simple principle that in a village, Every action has a reason, and every secret, no matter how carefully hidden, casts a shadow. Mr. Penrith had not been a beloved man. He had carried with him an air of unfinished business. Such men rarely depart without leaving complications behind. As the church clock struck 9, Miss Marple settled by her fire with her knitting once more. She thought of Clara's trembling hands, Mrs. Edgeworth's too careful composure, and the doctor's insistence on the obvious. She thought also of the valise, hollow and suspicious, and the dead bird, its meaning yet obscure. The pattern was not yet complete, but she felt in her bones that it was there, waiting to be discerned. In time, each thread would reveal its place. For now, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The investigation, such as it was, had only just begun. By the 3rd day after the garden party, the mood in St. Mary Mead had shifted from hushed shock to energetic speculation. The villagers, having tasted the drama of a sudden death, now began assigning blame with all the fervor of amateur detectives. The coroner's inquest had not yet been announced, but already the matter was decided in many minds. To them, Mr. Howard Penrith's end could not have been merely natural. It had to be the consequence of human malice. Constable Turner, though not a man given to leaps of imagination, found himself pulled along by this tide of opinion. He dutifully interviewed those who had been closest to Penrith at the time of his collapse, and certain names rose repeatedly. Clara Edgeworth was the first, her obvious distress interpreted by some as guilt rather than shock. Others pointed to Mrs. Edgeworth, whose composure struck them as unnatural. A few even whispered about the doctor himself, wondering why he was so insistent upon heart failure when evidence suggested otherwise. Miss Marple, for her part, sat quietly with her knitting as the theories swirled around her. She never discouraged the villagers from speaking, for their chatter often contained more truth than they realized. A half-finished sentence, a slip of the tongue, or even an over-eagerness to condemn another could reveal more than direct confession. She listened, she observed, and she stored away each fragment. Constable Turner called upon her again, this time less diffident than before. "The villagers are certain it was murder, Miss Marple," he said, taking off his hat at her gate. "But the question is who and why. Some say Clara had reason to resent Penrith. Others insist her aunt had more to gain. Between ourselves, I must narrow it down." Miss Marple poured him a modest cup of tea and replied with her usual gentleness. "It is seldom wise to narrow matters too quickly, Constable. One may fix upon a person because they appear agitated or composed, but people react in different ways to shock. I once knew a woman who laughed uncontrollably upon hearing dreadful news, and yet she was entirely innocent of any wrong. We must consider conduct in its context." Turner looked uncertain, but nodded. He asked about Clara in particular, noting that several guests had seen Penrith speaking sharply to her just before his death. "Might there have been a quarrel, do you suppose?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Young women, especially those who feel cornered, often betray fear in their countenance. Fear does not necessarily mean guilt. It may just as easily mean knowledge of something they cannot safely speak aloud. Meanwhile, Mrs. Price Ridley had taken it upon herself to gather every possible rumor concerning Clara. According to her, the young woman had been in correspondence with Mr. Penrith since before his return, and their conversation at the garden party was the continuation of some secret arrangement. Others disagreed, claiming Penrith had pressed Clara with unwanted attention. In either case, suspicion clung to the girl with cruel persistence. Mrs. Edgeworth did little to dispel the gossip. Her fierce protectiveness of her niece was interpreted by some as further proof of Clara's involvement. "Why shield her so determinedly?" asked Miss Hartnell at the post office. "Unless she has something dreadful to hide." It was the sort of reasoning that satisfied the village mind, though it lacked the precision Miss Marple preferred. Another name entered the circle of speculation. Mr. Stephen Waring, a solicitor from a nearby town who had been observed in deep conversation with Penrith earlier in the week. It was said that Waring had once represented creditors who suffered losses when Penrith left England years before. Some villagers decided at once that Waring had come to demand payment and that the confrontation had ended badly. Whether he had been present at the garden party at the crucial moment did not deter them from weaving their theories. At the inn one evening, the talk reached a fever pitch. Men leaned across tables, insisting the matter was simple. Clara was involved, the aunt was complicit, and the bird in the valise was a warning from Penrith to them both. Others argued that Penrith himself had brought about his doom by dabbling in questionable dealings overseas. The landlord shook his head over the noise. "Mark me, it's trouble from abroad that's followed him home. That valise wasn't ordinary luggage, it carried the past in it." Back in her neat sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on these notions. People were inclined to see foreign intrigue where none existed, simply because it added glamour to the story. Yet she suspected the explanation was closer to home, as it so often was. Villages, after all, contained every variety of human weakness. Greed, jealousy, and resentment did not require distant colonies to take root. The following morning, Miss Marple contrived another visit to Elmstead House under the guise of bringing flowers from her garden. She found Clara pale and withdrawn, her eyes avoiding her. Visitors? Mrs. Edgeworth was brisk, almost too brisk, as though determined to keep the conversation on safe topics. When Miss Marple gently inquired about Mr. Penrith, Clara flinched. "He frightened me," she said, so low that her aunt could scarcely hear. "He always frightened me." Before more could be said, Mrs. Edgeworth cut in, urging her niece upstairs to rest. That brief statement, however, was enough for Miss Marple to consider. Fear, not affection, had colored Clara's interactions with Penrith. Fear could be the motive for silence, but it could also be the motive for desperate action. The difficulty lay in discerning which it was. The inquest was scheduled for the end of the week, and anticipation grew with each passing day. Dr. Hayward maintained his insistence on heart failure, but the coroner, mindful of the village's agitation, ordered the valise and its contents examined. The bird, pitifully preserved in a box, was identified as nothing exotic at all, but a common starling. Why such a creature had been placed there remained unexplained. Theories multiplied, none entirely satisfactory. As the proceedings drew near, Constable Turner confided to Miss Marple that the police were leaning toward Clara as their principal suspect. "The girl was nearest to him, ma'am, and they say she had cause to resent his attention. I don't like to think of her, but evidence must be weighed." Miss Marple looked at him steadily over her spectacles. "It is often the case, Constable, that the person who appears most likely is the one most convenient. But convenience is not the same as truth. I would urge caution. Appearances deceive, and in such matters, they deceive most cruelly." That evening, as the last light faded across the village, Miss Marple sat with her knitting once more. The rhythm of the needles matched her steady thought. The village might be eager to condemn Clara, but she was not convinced. There were other possibilities, other faces that betrayed too much eagerness to deflect suspicion. She had not yet uncovered the full pattern, but she could sense its presence, like a tapestry turned to the wrong side, waiting to be revealed. The day of the inquest dawned grey, the sort of weather that seemed to weigh heavily upon the village. Clouds pressed low over the rooftops, and a faint drizzle clung to the hedgerows. The people of St. Mary Mead turned out in unusual numbers, not out of duty but out of curiosity. To them, the hearing was less a legal formality than a theatre in which each hoped their suspicions might be confirmed. Miss Marple took her customary seat near the back, knitting discreetly in her lap, her eyes calm but attentive. She had attended many such proceedings in her life, and she knew that the truth was not always revealed in the testimony itself, but in the manner of its delivery. Human nature betrayed itself in hesitation, in choice of words, in the small gestures made under strain. The coroner opened the session with a recitation of events, then called upon witnesses. Dr. Hayward spoke first, his confidence undimmed. He described the sudden collapse, the absence of visible struggle, and repeated his conclusion of heart failure. His tone was firm, his answers brisk. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth when the coroner asked whether he had detected any unusual odor. None worth remarking. The doctor replied too quickly as though to forestall further questioning. Mrs. Edgeworth followed, her testimony careful and composed. She spoke of her role as hostess, of seeing Mr. Penrith falter, and of her attempts to comfort Clara. When asked about the valise, she insisted it had been placed in her study immediately after the incident, untouched until the constable arrived. Miss Marple's eyes, however, caught the flicker of Clara's gaze as her aunt spoke. The girl's expression was not one of agreement, but of quiet dismay. Clara was then summoned. Pale, her hands trembling slightly, she confirmed that Penrith had spoken to her just before his collapse. Asked what he had said, she faltered. It was unpleasant, she whispered. Pressed further, she added, he told me I must do as he wished, or there would be consequences. The room stirred with murmurs. The coroner pressed for clarification, but Clara shook her head, lips tightly sealed. Miss Marple recognized the fear of a young woman protecting more than herself. The final object examined was the valise itself. Its worn leather, scuffed edges, and curious lightness were remarked upon. When opened, the dead starling was revealed again, to audible gasps from the villagers. Its feathers had dulled further with the passing days, its form pitiably small in the hollow space. The coroner asked who had last seen the bird alive, but no one could answer. It seemed to have materialized only at the garden party, its presence unexplained. The verdict, after much deliberation, was inconclusive. Death by causes unknown, the coroner pronounced, unwilling to commit to either natural or criminal explanation. The villagers left unsatisfied, though many continued to mutter about Clara's involvement. After the proceedings, Miss Marple walked slowly through the drizzle toward the churchyard path. She was joined, to her mild surprise, by Constable Turner. His manner was subdued. It gives us nothing certain, ma'am. Folks will say it's murder still, and they'll point the finger at the girl. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. And what do you say, Constable? He frowned. I don't know what to think. That bird in the valise, what sense does it make? A cruel trick? A warning? It doesn't fit. It fits, Constable, Miss Marple said gently, if one knows how to look. People often reveal themselves in small, careless ways. Consider, for instance, the lining of the valise. He glanced at her, puzzled. The lining? Yes. When it was opened, I noticed a tear along the seam, very slight frayed edge, as though something had been hastily concealed or removed. One might overlook it, but fabric tells its own story. The valise was not simply hollow, had been altered. That detail troubles me. Turner's eyes widened, though he was reluctant to admit the value of her observation. I hadn't noticed, ma'am. You think it means something? I think it suggests Mr. Penrith carried with him more than a bird, she replied. Something else was once hidden there, and someone took care to remove it. The bird may have been meant to distract from the absence of whatever was lost. The constable scratched his chin, uncertain, but Miss Marple's quiet confidence made the idea linger in his mind. That evening, back in her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. Clara's fear, Mrs. Edgeworth's careful answers, the doctor's overconfidence, dismissal, these details formed a pattern, though the full design was not yet visible. The torn lining of the valise, however, stood out as the first true thread. If one pulled at it carefully, the entire fabric of deception might unravel. As she set aside her knitting, she remembered a childhood acquaintance who had once hidden letters in the hem of her skirt, thinking no one would ever find them. But clothes and bags and household objects all betrayed their secrets eventually, especially to eyes trained to notice what others ignored. The village, meanwhile, settled into restless anticipation. Some insisted Clara would soon be arrested. Others whispered that the murderer, whoever they were, still walked freely among them. Doors were locked earlier at night, and conversations dropped to whispers when strangers passed. Yet beneath the unease, there was also fascination. For all their fear, the villagers relished the drama, as though it were a novel unfolding in their midst. Miss Marple alone saw past the chatter to the deeper truth that behind Penrith's death lay a web of secrets stretching far into the lives of those around him. The hollow valise had carried more than a dead burden carried the weight of unfinished business, of betrayals yet unspoken, and it was only a matter of time before those hidden threads began to show themselves more clearly. She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze distant but serene. The mystery was not solved, nor nearly so. Yet she felt the first stirrings of certainty, the quiet conviction that the smallest clue, once rightly understood, would lead to the heart of the matter. The days following the inquest were unsettled ones in St. Mary Mead. Though the coroner's verdict had been non-committal, the villagers were not content to let the matter rest. Conversations at the grocer's, the butcher's, and the post office returned ceaselessly to the same questions. What had really killed Howard Penrith? What had the strange bird meant, and what was Clara Edgeworth hiding? The village, never short of theories, now became a stage of small confrontations. Suspicion had a way of creeping into ordinary exchanges. Neighbors eyed one another with sharpness, and old slights, once politely ignored, came to the surface under the pressure of gossip. It was at the post office that Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price Ridley accosting Clara directly. The young woman had ventured out for the first time since the inquest, her face pale beneath her straw hat. She had scarcely placed her letters on the counter when Mrs. Price Ridley swept forward, her voice low but cutting. "You will forgive me, my dear," she began with false sweetness. "But people do talk. They say Mr. Penrith pressed you dreadfully before his death. One wonders why you would not speak up at the inquest if you had nothing to conceal." Clara stiffened, her eyes glistening. "I have nothing to conceal," she replied, her voice trembling. "He frightened me. Yes, but that is all. Please leave me be." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "We are all anxious for the truth, child. If you know more than you are saying, it is your duty to speak." Clara fled the shop, her letters forgotten, and Miss Marple, who had watched quietly from her place by the rack of postcards, thought to herself how dangerous such public bullying could be. Fear drove people to silence as surely as guilt. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Mr. Stephen Waring, the solicitor from the nearby town who had been linked with Penrith's financial past. He was a tall man, carefully dressed, with a face that betrayed irritation more than grief. He wasted no time in addressing the matter. "I thought it best to call on you, Miss Marple," he said stiffly. "I'm aware that you often involve yourself in these village affairs. Rumor is a dreadful thing, and I should like to set certain matters straight." Miss Marple poured him tea and listened with her accustomed patience. "It is true," Waring continued, "that I represented certain creditors when Mr. Penrith fled England. He left behind debts and obligations, and his departure was most inconvenient. I did speak with him after his return. He was evasive, naturally, but I have no interest in pursuing old quarrels now. The debts are long written off. I would be obliged if you made that clear to the gossips of your village." Miss Marple inclined her head. It must have been a difficult conversation. Mr. Waring people are apt to remember money owed, even when the law no longer compels repayment. He colored faintly. "It wasn't pleasant, no. But I assure you, my conscience is clear. If Penrith died, it was not at my hand." When he left, Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence. His denial was firm, yet it had the brittle edge of a man eager to distance himself too quickly. She made a note of his visit in her quiet mind. The following day brought another small revelation. A maid from Elmstead House, overcome with nerves, confided in Miss Marple as the older lady passed through the village. "Lane." The girl twisted her apron in her hands as she spoke. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but I thought someone ought to know." The night after Mr. Penrith died, I saw Mrs. Edgeworth in the study. She was looking through the valise, though she'd told the constable it had been left alone. She stopped when she saw me, and she told me never to mention it. But I cannot rest easy, ma'am, not with the village saying all manner of things. Miss Marple thanked the girl with gentle words and sent her on her way. It was confirmation of what she had already suspected. The valise had been tampered with. Mrs. Edgeworth, for all her dignity, had secrets of her own. That evening, Miss Marple considered the matter over her knitting. Clara's fear, Mrs. Edgeworth's secretive behavior, Waring's defensive visit, each piece pointed to hidden truths, though not all to the same one. She reflected on how people, when under strain, often revealed themselves most clearly. The maid's simple honesty, Clara's trembling, and the aunt's rigid control were telling contrasts. The village, meanwhile, continued its fever of speculation. At the inn, a farmer declared loudly that Penrith must have been poisoned with some foreign draught, smuggled in his valise. At the vicarage, the Reverend Leonard suggested solemnly that the dead bird was symbolic, perhaps intended to frighten rather than harm. Each theory gained adherents, only to be replaced by another the following day. The truth, Miss Marple knew, lay not in the grandeur of exotic explanations, but in the ordinariness of human behavior. People did not need faraway poisons or sinister rituals to commit dreadful acts. A little bitterness, a little fear, and the chance of opportunity that was often enough. On the third evening after the inquest, a confrontation erupted at Elmstead House. Clara, overheard by a maid, raised her voice against her aunt. "I cannot bear it any longer. You keep everything locked away, as if silence will save us. But it will not. It only makes it worse." Mrs. Edgeworth's reply was firm and cold. "You will say nothing, Clara. Not a word. Do you hear me? Whatever he threatened, whatever he held over us, it died with him. We shall not shame this family further." The maid reported the quarrel to her companions, and soon the village hummed with renewed vigor. Some claimed Clara was on the brink of confession. Others insisted Mrs. Edgeworth was concealing her own guilt. The tale twisted and grew with every telling, until it bore only a faint resemblance to truth. Miss Marple, walking in her garden under the fading light, reflected on the confrontation. It confirmed her belief that Penrith had held some power over the Edgeworth women, a power that had not vanished with his death. Secrets had a way of festering, and when forced into silence, they could become dangerous indeed. She bent to clip a rose, her hands steady despite the gravity of her thoughts. The case was far from over. In fact, it was only now beginning to reveal its darker corners. The hollow valise had been more than a curiosity. It was the vessel of secrets, the catalyst for truths long buried to come to the surface. And as she looked toward the quiet houses of the village, Miss Marple felt certain that another twist lay ahead. For when people clung so tightly to concealment, the truth had a habit of breaking free in the most unexpected and unsettling of ways. It was on the 5th morning after the inquest that the village awoke to yet another disturbance. The news spread first from the baker's shop, then to the grocer's, and by mid-morning had reached every ear in St. Mary Mead. The study at Elmstead House had been broken into during the night. The lock on the French windows was forced, and drawers had been rifled. Nothing of value appeared to be missing, but the disturbance was enough to rouse fresh speculation. Miss Marple heard it from young Tommy, the butcher's boy, who arrived breathless at her gate. "They say burglars, ma'am. But my mum thinks it's someone looking for that value. Everyone says so." His eyes shone with excitement. Miss Marple smiled kindly, gave him a coin for his trouble, and returned to her knitting with thoughtful eyes. A burglary so soon after a suspicious death was unlikely to be a coincidence. What was more, it suggested that whatever Penrith had carried in that valise had not yet been found. By mid-afternoon, Constable Turner was making his rounds again, and he arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a weary expression. "It's a muddle, ma'am," he confessed. "The study is in disorder, drawers pulled out, papers scattered. but Mrs. Edgeworth swears nothing is missing. The valise, though, that's gone." Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "Gone, Constable. That is very interesting indeed." Turner nodded grimly. "Vanished. She claims it was still there when she locked up for the night. This morning it was nowhere to be seen. I can't make sense of it. Who would take such a thing, and why? It's only a shabby old case." "Shabby, yes," Miss Marple agreed softly, "but of great importance, I suspect, to someone who wished its secrets kept hidden. A torn lining, a hollow space, the body of a bird are not trifles, Constable. They point to something once concealed there, something worth stealing." That evening, rumors multiplied like ivy on old stone. Some claimed Clara herself had taken the valise to destroy evidence. Others said Mrs. Edgeworth had arranged the burglary to conceal the truth once and for all. A few insisted it was outsiders, professional thieves who had learned of Penrith's past. Yet those who knew St. Mary Mead best suspected the hand of someone much nearer home. Miss Marple, meanwhile, accepted a quiet invitation to tea at the vicarage, where the Reverend Leonard and his wife were eager to discuss the affair. Mrs. Leonard, flustered by both excitement and indignation, could not contain herself. "It is disgraceful, Jane," she exclaimed. "Our peaceful village reduced to this, a murderer near enough and now a burglary. I declare I do not know what the world is coming to, and that poor Clara, hounded at every turn, though between ourselves I cannot help feeling she knows more than she lets on." Miss Marple sipped her tea with quiet composure. "Young women are often the repository of confidence, dear. It does not mean they are guilty. It means, perhaps, they are burdened." The Reverend nodded gravely. "I confess," he said, "I was not fond of Mr. Penrith. He carried with him an air of unfinished sin. If there is more to be uncovered, perhaps the Almighty will see fit to bring it to light." The burglary, however, brought with it not only speculation but a new lead. The constable discovered footprints in the damp soil near the French windows. They were not large, nor particularly heavy, but they bore the distinct impression of a narrow heel unmistakably belonging to a woman's shoe. When this detail was whispered through the village, it ignited a fresh wave of accusation. Clara's name rose once again, for she was young and light of step, and who else but she would have had reason to steal the case? But others shook their heads and pointed to Mrs. Edgeworth herself, whose fierce determination to protect her niece might extend even to breaking into her own study under cover of darkness. Miss Marple considered the matter quietly. Footprints were useful, but they could mislead. Shoes were easily borrowed or imitated, and soil impressions were seldom conclusive. Yet the very fact of the burglary, combined with the disappearance of the valise, confirmed her growing conviction that Penrith's death was not an isolated misfortune. It was the center of a web, and the threads stretched in several directions at once. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she was disturbed by a knock at her door. It was Clara Edgeworth, her face pale, her eyes red from weeping. She clutched a small parcel in her hands. "I didn't know where else to go," Clara whispered. "I cannot trust my aunt, and the constable frightens me. But everyone says you understand." Miss Marple guided her gently inside, seated her by the fire, and waited. At last, Clara placed the parcel on the table. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it, revealing a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased with age. "It was hidden in the valise," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I found it the night of the garden party, before they took it away. I didn't mean to steal, but I was so frightened. I thought if anyone saw it, it would ruin us." Miss Marple unfolded the paper carefully. It was a letter, written in Penrith's hand, addressed not to Clara, but to Mrs. Edgeworth. Its contents were stark and threatening a demand for money, coupled with the promise that if payment were not made, certain long-buried secrets of the Edgeworth family would be made public. Clara clasped her hands tightly. "You see, he was blackmailing her. He wanted money, and he said dreadful things would be exposed if she refused. My aunt swore me to silence, but now, with the burglary, with everything, cannot bear it. Please, Miss Marple, tell me what to do." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand over Clara's. "My dear, you have done the right thing in bringing this to me. Secrets kept in fear have a way of turning poisonous. Whatever your aunt believes, truth is safer than silence." As Clara left, relieved yet still trembling, Miss Marple folded the letter once more and placed it carefully away. The twist in the case had revealed itself. Penrith had not merely returned as a prodigal son of the village. He had come as a blackmailer, intent on exploiting the past for gain. His death, then, was unlikely to be a chance. Miss Marple sat for a long time after Clara's departure, her knitting untouched in her lap. She thought of the burglary, of the missing valise, and of the woman's footprints in the soil. She thought, too, of Mrs. Edgeworth's rigid silence and the doctor's too quick dismissal of poison. The pattern grew clearer, though not yet complete. The bird in the valise, the torn lining, the vanished case, all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed not outward to foreign intrigue, but inward to the very heart of the village. And Miss Marple, gazing into the quiet embers of her fire, felt certain that the next revelation would bring danger closer still. For when blackmail enters a story, violence is never far behind. The revelation of Penrith's blackmail letter altered the entire complexion of the case. Miss Marple sat the following morning with her knitting basket beside her, though she scarcely touched the needles. Her mind, sharp despite the appearance of gentle distraction, moved carefully through each possibility. Penrith had demanded money from Mrs. Edgeworth, threatening exposure of secrets long buried. Clara, trembling with fear, had brought the letter to Miss Marple in desperation. And someone, perhaps desperate themselves, broke into Elmstead House to steal the valise, hoping to suppress further evidence. It was clear to Miss Marple that whoever had killed Penrith, if indeed murder it was, had been driven not merely by anger, but by self-preservation. Blackmail was a cruel trade, capable of driving even the most respectable people to desperate acts. Yet what remained was to discern who among the suspects had crossed that line. Constable Turner, still dutiful but increasingly overwhelmed, confided to Miss Marple in low tones as they walked together down the lane. "The burglary points to someone local, ma'am. A stranger could not have entered so quietly. And the letter, well, that gives motive, doesn't it?" Mrs. Edgeworth herself had reason enough. Miss Marple nodded mildly. "Indeed, Constable. But one must be cautious. When one person is threatened, it is rarely only they who suffer. Secrets often entangle others as well, binding them together in ways not immediately visible." She decided that it was time to see how the players in this small drama would behave under subtle provocation. Human nature, she knew, was like fine china. A little pressure in just the right place could reveal hidden cracks. That afternoon, she paid a call to Dr. Hayward. His surgery was modest, with a brass plate on the door polished to a shine. He welcomed her with polite courtesy, though his eyes betrayed irritation. "Another inquiry, Miss Marple?" he asked with a tight smile. "I assure you, I've given my professional opinion. There is nothing further to be added." Miss Marple settled comfortably in his waiting chair, arranging her gloves with deliberate care. "Oh, I do not doubt your professional knowledge, Doctor. Yet I was thinking how curious it is that the coroner found the cause of death uncertain. The village whispers, of course, and some say poison. I confess it did put me in mind of that dreadful case years ago, when a gentleman's wine-glass was tampered with. Such things can be done so very easily, and often escape notice even by the most skilled physician." Dr. Hayward flushed, his lips pressing into a line. "You imply I overlooked something." "Nonsense, Miss Marple. I examined him myself." Of course," she replied gently, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "It was only a passing thought. I am sure, if it had been poison, the faint smell of almonds might have been more noticeable. Perhaps I imagined it altogether." His eyes flicked to hers, startled, before he turned away to shuffle papers on his desk. "There was no such smell," he said firmly, but the tremor in his voice betrayed unease. Miss Marple left him soon after, satisfied not with proof but with the trace of guilt his reaction had revealed. Whether his anxiety arose from error or complicity remained to be seen. Her next call was upon Mrs. Edgeworth. The lady received her in the drawing-room, as stiff and composed as ever. Clara sat nearby, her embroidery untouched in her lap. "I thought," Miss Marple began kindly, "that you might wish to know that the village believes the burglary was meant to remove evidence against poor Clara. People can be cruel, you see. They do love to fix upon the most vulnerable." Mrs. Edgeworth's eyes flashed. "Clara had nothing to do with it. I will not have her slandered." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "It is admirable the way you protect her. But I did wonder, my dear, whether the valise contained something more dangerous than a dead bird. Something written, perhaps." The faintest tremor passed across Mrs. Edgeworth's face, but she quickly recovered. "You deal in idle fancies, Miss Marple." There was nothing. Clara, however, could not suppress the tightening of her hands, the way her eyes flickered toward her aunt. It was confirmation enough for Miss Marple that the girl had told the truth about the letter, and her aunt remained determined to bury it. Later at the village shop, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Waring, the solicitor. She greeted him with her customary warmth and remarked casually, "I believe, Mr. Penrith kept careful records of his dealings. It would be dreadful for those records to fall into the wrong hands. I should think a man in your position would be anxious to see them destroyed." Waring stiffened, his color rising. "Destroyed? Why should I care what papers he kept?" His voice carried the indignation of a man too quick to defend himself. "I told you before, Miss Marple, my business with him is long concluded. I have no interest in his affairs now." Yet his agitation betrayed him. Miss Marple thanked him sweetly and allowed the conversation to end, noting his reaction with satisfaction. That evening, Miss Marple reflected on her quiet tests. Each person touched by Penrith's return had shown cracks when the subject of evidence was raised. The doctor flinched at the suggestion of poison. Mrs. Edgeworth stiffened at the mention of a letter. Waring bristled at the thought of records. All were entangled, all had reasons to wish Penrith were silenced. The question was not who had motive, but who had seized the moment. Miss Marple placed her knitting aside and gazed into the fire. She knew that truth often revealed itself when least expected, in a careless remark or a sudden flare of temper. She needed only wait a little longer, guiding gently until one of them betrayed themselves fully. The hollow valise, once dismissed as shabby luggage, had proved the key to every revelation, and though it had now vanished, its shadow lingered over the village, pressing upon guilty consciences. Miss Marple smiled faintly, the smile of one who recognized the pattern forming at last. A little more patience, a little more careful watching, and the final piece would fall into place. But she also sensed that danger was drawing nearer, for those who fear exposure can grow reckless. The stage was set, and though she remained outwardly the mild old lady in her garden chair, Miss Marple knew the most decisive act of the drama was soon to begin. The evening following her subtle conversations, Miss Marple prepared for what she knew must come next. The threads were ready to be drawn together, and though she did not relish confrontation, truth demanded it. She had observed long enough, listened long enough, and now the time had come to make plain what lay beneath the surface of polite conversation. She invited Constable Turner to her cottage under the pretext of tea. He arrived, looking weary, his notebook bulging with conflicting statements from villagers. "It doesn't add up, ma'am," he admitted, shaking his head. "Every time I think I've got a clear suspect, something else turns me around. The burglary, the letter, the doctor's insistence, the aunt's secrecy can't tie it together." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "That is because you are trying to pin guilt upon a single point, Constable, without seeing the whole pattern. Human nature, you see, is like embroidery. From the back it looks like a tangle of knots and loose threads, but when you turn it over, the design is plain. One must only know when to turn it." The constable looked at her uncertainly. "Do you mean, ma'am, you know who did it?" "I believe I do," she said gently. "And I think it's best we gather those most concerned. People speak differently when the truth is laid in front of them." Thus it was that the following afternoon a small assembly gathered in the drawing-room at Elmstead House. Mrs. Edgeworth, stiff and defensive; Clara, pale and anxious; Dr. Hayward, outwardly calm but betraying a tightness around the mouth; and Mr. Waring, the solicitor, reluctant but present. Constable Turner stood by the fireplace, his notebook ready, while Miss Marple sat primly in a high-backed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. She began in her usual mild voice, as though discussing the weather. "It has been said that Mr. Penrith died of heart failure. That was the doctor's conclusion. And yet I could not help noticing certain small details. A faint smell of almonds, a bluish tinge about the lips, symptoms consistent with poisoning. And though the coroner declined to name it, the village has whispered the same." Dr. Hayward stirred. "Speculation," he said curtly. "Without evidence, it is mere fancy." "Quite so," Miss Marple replied. "But evidence comes in many forms, Doctor. Not all of it lies in test tubes or under microscopes. Sometimes it lies in human behavior." She turned her gaze toward Mrs. Edgeworth. "You see, Mr. Penrith was not merely an unwelcome guest. He was a blackmailer. I have seen the letter he wrote to you, demanding money under threat of exposure. That, I think, is why you were so determined to keep Clara silent. But you did not kill him, did you?" Mrs. Edgeworth's face was drained of color. "I sought only to protect my family's name," she whispered. "Yes, he threatened me, but I swear I had no hand in his death." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Indeed, fear makes you conceal, but concealment is not the same as murder." Clara, her eyes wide, looked from her aunt to Miss Marple. "Then if not her, who?" "Patience, my dear," Miss Marple murmured. She shifted her gaze to Waring. "You too, Mr. Waring, had cause to resent Penrith. Old debts, old quarrels. When I suggested he might have kept records, you reacted most sharply, but your indignation betrayed anxiety, not guilt. You wished the matter was forgotten, yet you did not seek his death." Waring bristled, but he did not deny it. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she turned lastly to Dr. Hayward. "Which leaves you, Doctor. You who insisted so firmly upon heart failure. You who denied, perhaps too quickly, that there was any scent of almonds. And you who alone had the means to administer poison without detection." The doctor's face darkened. "You accuse me without proof?" "Not without proof," Miss Marple said quietly. "I recall a small thing, the glass of water you gave Mr. Penrith after his collapse. But before that, I recall another detail. When he arrived at the garden party, he drank from a cup of tea. It was poured by your hand, Doctor, as you stood speaking with Mrs. Edgeworth at the table. A kind gesture, it seemed. Yet when I looked later, his cup bore the faintest residue. No one else drank from it. And soon after, he was dead." There was a silence, broken only by Clara's sharp intake of breath. The constable stepped forward. "Doctor!" Hayward's composure cracked. "He was a scoundrel," he burst out, "a parasite. Do you know what he threatened? He knew things about patients, about families, confidences entrusted to me in my practice. He said he would expose them, twist them, and destroy their reputations. He would have ruined me, ruined this village. I could not allow it." Miss Marple's voice was steady, almost sorrowful. "And so you slipped poison into his cup. You thought it merciful, perhaps, quick and discreet. But poison leaves its mark, Doctor. And guilt, too, leaves its trace upon the conscience." Mrs. Edgeworth covered her mouth with her hand. Clara clung to the arm of her chair, tears welling. Waring shook his head in grim recognition. Constable Turner, his expression grave, stepped closer. "I'm sorry, Doctor. You'll have to come with me." For a moment, Hayward stood rigid, as though defiance still burned in him. Then his shoulders sagged, and the fight drained from his eyes. "He would have destroyed us all," he muttered. "You do not know what secrets he carried." Miss Marple rose slowly, her hands steady on her knitting. "Secrets, Doctor, have a way of coming out in time, whether by blackmail or confession. But murder is never the answer. It only weaves more sorrow into the pattern." As Turner led the doctor away, the room remained hushed. Mrs. Edgeworth sat with bowed head. Clara clung silently to her aunt, and Mr. Waring stared into the fire, his jaw tight. Miss Marple gathered her things with quiet efficiency. "The truth," she said gently, "is rarely welcome, but it is always better than fear. Now, perhaps, Saint, Mary Mead may find peace again, though it may take time." She stepped out into the cool evening air, the sound of the constable's departing footsteps fading behind her. The roses in the Edgeworth garden glowed faintly in the fading light, their beauty unchanged despite all that had transpired. Miss Marple paused to admire them, reflecting, as she often did, that human nature bore much the same qualities, fragile, thorned, and yet resilient. The village, she knew, would gossip for weeks to come. They would speculate on the doctor's motives, on the Edgeworth family's secrets, and on what might have been hidden in the hollow valise. But for her, the matter was settled. The design of the eyes pattern was complete. And though she remained the same quiet old lady in the eyes of her neighbors, Miss Marple knew that she had once again pierced the veil of deception to reveal the truth that lay beneath. The arrest of Dr. Hayward cast a long shadow over Saint. Mary Mead. For many villagers, the doctor had been a figure of authority and reliability, a man whose word was trusted in matters of health and family. That he had been unmasked as a murderer unsettled the very foundation of village life. People gathered in hushed circles outside the post office, speaking with both shock and relish. They declared they had always suspected something amiss, or else that they could never have imagined it. Such is the way of gossip. It bends to whichever wind blows strongest. Mrs. Price Ridley, of course, proclaimed herself vindicated. "I always said there was more to it," she announced loudly at the grocer's. "A sudden death in the middle of a garden party. Too convenient by half. You see, it was not poor Clara after all." Yet even as she spoke, she could not resist turning suspicion elsewhere. Though one must admit Mrs. Edgeworth behaved most curiously. Protecting her niece, locking things away was most unwise. Clara herself seldom appeared in public. When she did, she was greeted with sympathetic nods from some and wary glances from others. She walked with her head lowered, her arm held protectively by her aunt. Mrs. Edgeworth remained as composed as ever, though her once commanding presence had softened into something more guarded. The blackmail letter still weighed heavily upon her, and though its contents were not widely known, enough whispers circulated to keep her reputation under strain. Mr. Waring, the solicitor, left the village soon after the doctor's arrest. His departure, though explained as business, was understood by many as a retreat. Few cared to speculate further, for the spectacle of Hayward's downfall provided enough material to fill every teacup conversation for weeks. Constable Turner went about his duties with renewed seriousness. Though he accepted Miss Marple's deductions with gratitude, he could not quite hide a touch of embarrassment at having overlooked the signs she had seen so clearly. He told anyone who asked that justice would run its course, that the trial would settle matters, and that the village need not fear further disturbance. Miss Marple, however, knew that peace in a village was never so simple. Human nature remained unchanged, no matter how dramatic the events. Secrets still lingered in the corners of parlors, grudges still brewed beneath polite greetings, and ambition or envy might, in time, spark new trouble. One afternoon, some days after the arrest, Miss Marple received a visit from Clara. The girl sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly together. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. "If you had not spoken, I do not know what would have become of me. Everyone believed the the worst of me. Even my aunt thought silence would protect us, but it nearly destroyed us. Miss Marple reached out and patted the girl's hand with quiet kindness. My dear, the truth is often painful, but it is always lighter to carry than fear. You are young, and you must not let this shadow linger longer than it must. The village will forget in time. They always do. Clara's eyes filled with tears. But the secrets that he knew of us secrets have a way of losing their power when they are brought into the light, Miss Marple replied. It is the hidden thing that grows monstrous. Once seen, it is merely human, and humans are very much the same everywhere. That is something I've observed all my life. After Clara left, the old lady sat for some time with her knitting, reflecting on the course of events. Penrith had returned not as a prodigal son, but as a parasite, feeding upon the fears of others. He had chosen blackmail, the most destructive of trades, and in so doing had sealed his own fate. Dr. Hayward, who had once sworn to heal, had been driven by desperation into a betrayal of his profession and his conscience, and Mrs. Edgeworth, though not guilty of murder, had nearly sacrificed her niece to silence, believing that secrecy would preserve what in truth was already broken. The hollow valise itself was never recovered. Some said it had been taken away by whoever ransacked the study, hidden in a hedge or tossed into a river. Others insisted Mrs. Edgeworth had concealed it to the end, but Miss Marple considered it merely a symbol, an empty vessel that once carried both threat and deception. Its absence mattered little. The truth it had concealed was already exposed. As the days lengthened into summer, the village resumed its rhythms. The roses bloomed in cottage gardens, the postman delivered his letters, and children played once more in the lanes. Yet there was an undercurrent of caution in conversations, a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life lay the capacity for betrayal and violence. Miss Marple walked her garden in the evening light, pruning here and watering there. To a casual eye, she appeared only a frail old lady tending her flowers. Yet her thoughts moved far beyond roses and hedgerows. She thought of the delicate balance of trust within a village, of how easily it could be fractured by greed or fear. She thought of the way human beings, no matter how genteel their surroundings, repeated the same patterns of folly and vice. Still, she was not melancholy. To Miss Marple, the world's frailties were no surprise. They were to be expected, like thorns on a rose bush, and she accepted them with the same quiet patience she gave to her knitting. Evils, she knew, could be defeated not only by force, but by understanding, by recognizing the small truths that others overlooked. As she closed her garden gate and turned toward her cottage, the evening air carried the faint sound of laughter from the inn. Life in St. Mary Mead was resuming its familiar tune. The villagers would gossip, yes, but they would also bake their cakes, attend their teas, and tend their gardens. In time, Penrith's death would become another story, folded into the long memory of the place. Miss Marple, ever observant, smiled faintly. She had once more witnessed the unchanging play of human nature, with its petty cruelties and unexpected kindnesses. The hollow valise had been the stage, the blackmail letter the script, but the actors were the same as they ever were, men and women driven by fear, by pride, by the desperate wish to preserve appearances. She stepped into her parlor, set her knitting by the chair and lit a small lamp. The light glowed warmly across the neat room, casting no shadows but those that belonged naturally. For Miss Marple, the case was closed, but the study of human hearts was never-ending. The weeks following the doctor's arrest passed with a curious mixture of relief and unease. Life in St. Mary Mead resumed its ordinary rhythm, yet it was not quite the same as before. There was always, in the air, the lingering sense that even those thought most respectable could harbor dangerous secrets. For all his confidence and professional dignity, Doctor, Hayward had been revealed as both blackmailed and, finally, a murderer. Such a revelation was not easily absorbed by a village accustomed to its own quiet certainties. At the market, Conversations began with the price of butter or the freshness of lettuce, but soon slipped into whispered comments about the case. Some declared that Penrith had brought it upon himself. Others pitied the doctor, speaking of him as a good man driven to desperation. Still others wondered what secrets Penrith had carried with him that would have caused such fear. But as always, the villagers soon grew tired of speculation and moved on to new matters. A fête was planned at the vicarage, and the annual flower competition became the fresh subject of rivalry. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her days much as she always had. She tended her roses, wrote letters to old friends, and knitted steadily in her garden chair. Outwardly, she was unchanged, the same gentle old lady who always seemed to know more than she ought. Yet within, she reflected often on what had passed. Cases such as this left impressions not so easily dismissed. She thought of Clara, whose pale face had haunted her in the early days of suspicion. Now, with the weight of accusation lifted, the girl was recovering her composure. Miss Marple saw her one morning on the lane, walking arm in arm with a young man from the neighbouring parish. Her laughter, though still a little tentative, rang fresh and hopeful. Youth, Miss Marple thought, has the merciful gift of healing quickly, provided it is not crushed entirely. Mrs. Edgeworth remained more brittle. Though the blackmail letter had been destroyed, the knowledge of her near ruin weighed heavily. She continued to host teas and luncheons, but with a formality that kept even her friends at a distance. Miss Marple, observing quietly, understood her predicament. The fear of scandal had driven her into silence, and though she was not guilty of murder, she had nearly allowed her niece to suffer the worst of village suspicion. It was a lesson the lady would not soon forget. Of Mr. Waring, little more was heard. His visits to St. Mary Mead ceased, and his business took him elsewhere. Yet Miss Marple considered him with some pity. He too had lived under the shadow of Penrith's threats, and though he had not yielded to violence, the encounter had unsettled him. People like Waring, Miss Marple knew, preferred life neatly ordered and their reputations unsullied. Penrith had threatened that very order, and men of Waring's type often carried their fear long after the danger was past. The hollow valise itself was never recovered. Some boys playing near the stream claimed they had seen an old leather case floating downstream, but by the time anyone investigated, nothing could be found. Perhaps it had been cast away deliberately, its purpose served. Perhaps it still lay hidden in some hedgerow, rotting quietly with the years. To Miss Marple, its disappearance mattered little. The object had been only the container of secrets once the truth was revealed. Its hollow shell no longer carried weight. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of rose and gold, Miss Marple sat on her veranda with her knitting untouched on her lap. She reflected on the curious symmetry of the affair. A man returned to the village carrying nothing but a shabby valise, and within weeks the equilibrium of St. Mary Mead was overturned. His greed and cruelty had been his undoing, but his presence had also revealed the fragility of those around him. Secrets that had lain dormant for years had surfaced. Fear had driven one woman into silence, another into suspicion, and a man of medicine into deadly resolve. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though without mirth. It was all so very human. People often imagined that crime was born of grand passions or extraordinary evil. Yet, in her experience, it was almost always the product of small, ordinary weaknesses, fear of exposure, hunger for money, and the desire to preserve one's reputation. These were the motives that repeated themselves again and again, no matter the village or the decade. The sound of church bells drifted through the evening air, steady and familiar. Life moved forward, as it always did. Children would grow, gardens would bloom, and the gossip of the moment would fade into memory. Yet Miss Marple knew that the lessons of the case would remain, at least for her. She had once again seen how appearances deceived, how truth lay not in loud claims or obvious signs, but in the small gestures that others dismissed. Constable Turner stopped by a few days later, bringing with him a modest bouquet of daisies as a token of thanks. "I don't know how you do it, ma'am," he said, shifting awkwardly on his feet. "You see things no one else does. If it hadn't been for you, the doctor might still be walking free." Miss Marple accepted the flowers with a gentle smile. "It is not cleverness, Constable, only observation. People are very much the same everywhere. If one has spent a lifetime in a village, one learns to read their little habits, their fears, their vanities. Once you recognize those patterns, the truth is often quite plain." He nodded, though he did not entirely grasp the depth of her words. He left reassured, and Miss Marple placed the daisies in a small jug by the window. As twilight deepened, she returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. Her needles clicked softly in the quiet room, the rhythm steady and unhurried. Outside, the village settled into calm, its houses glowing with lamplight, its lanes quiet but for the occasional call of a bird. Miss Marple allowed herself one final reflection before the evening closed. Evil, she thought, did not come upon Saint. Merry mead in the form of monsters or strangers. It came in the guise of ordinary men and women, familiar faces twisted by fear or greed. And it was in understanding those very ordinary motives that justice could be served. She folded her knitting neatly, rose to close the curtains, and lit her lamp. Another case ended, another shadow lifted. Tomorrow would bring roses to prune, letters to answer, and perhaps the vicar's wife for tea. Life, for Miss Marple, continued as it always had, serene on the surface, keenly observant beneath. For though the hollow valise had vanished, the truths it carried had been laid bare, and Miss Marple's quiet triumph lay in the certainty that she had once again seen clearly into the heart of human nature. The summer ripened slowly in Saint, merry mead as though determined to soothe the memory of recent disturbances. Roses tumbled over cottage fences, bees hummed lazily in the lavender, and the lanes filled again with the easy chatter of villagers returning to their routines. Outwardly, nothing seemed to have changed, yet beneath the familiar rhythms lingered the faint echo of the garden party, the collapse of Howard Penrith, and the dark revelations that followed. At the inn, talk of the case still surfaced when the evenings grew long. Farmers leaned on their mugs of ale and speculated whether the doctor would ever stand trial, or if some compromise of reputation and influence would intervene. Others spoke of Penrith himself, wondering what further secrets he had carried to his grave. The hollow valise remained the subject of half-remembered tales. Some said it had been buried beneath a hedge. Others swore they had glimpsed it abandoned on the moor. In time it would become legend, embroidered into local lore until fact and fancy were indistinguishable. Miss Marple, however, did not concern herself with legends. For her, the case was closed, the pattern complete. She went about her days with the same quiet diligence as always. In the mornings, she tended her roses, their petals heavy with dew. In the afternoons, she knitted in her chair by the window, pausing only to greet neighbors who stopped by with trivial matters that often carried more significance than they knew. She was content, as she always was, to let the village reveal itself in its small, ordinary ways. Clara Edgeworth came to see her one afternoon, a little stronger now. Her color had returned. She spoke shyly of plans to visit cousins in Bath, of the possibility of new beginnings far from the shadow of her uncle's threats. Miss Marple listened with warmth and encouraged her gently. "You must allow yourself to live, my dear. Do not let fear bind you to the past. You have youth on your side, and youth should not be wasted in silence." Clara left with gratitude in her eyes, and Miss Marple watched her go with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Edgeworth, too, came eventually, though her visit was more formal. She thanked Miss Marple in clipped tones, unable quite to express her relief without acknowledging the shame she still carried. Miss Marple received her with her usual courtesy, offering tea and seed cake, and asked nothing in return, for she understood that pride, even when wounded, sought its own way of healing. Constable Turner continued to call occasionally, eager to discuss the progress of the case. Though he bore himself with increasing confidence, He never failed to show respect for Miss Marple's insight. "It still amazes me," he admitted once, "how you saw through it all when the rest of us were chasing shadows." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking gently. "People reveal themselves, Constable. They do not mean to, but they cannot help it. A glance here, a word there, an over-eagerness or a silence, it is all very telling. One only needs to have lived long enough to recognize it." He left with renewed determination, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that he would remember her words long after the village had moved on to fresher gossip. The hollow valise itself remained the story's most curious relic. To some, it symbolized Penrith's greed, to others his cruelty, and to a few his mysterious past abroad. To Miss Marple, it was merely a vessel, emptied of its purpose once the truth was known. The dead bird within it, too, had been no omen or foreign talisman, only a distraction meant to confuse. Yet how it had stirred the imagination of the villagers, who longed for drama where in truth there was only human frailty. On a quiet Sunday evening, Miss Marple attended an evensong at the parish church. The hymns rose softly through the dim light, and she joined in with her thin but steady voice. Afterwards, as she walked slowly home beneath the elms, she reflected on the nature of justice. It was not always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it was simply the unmasking of human weakness, the patient unraveling of lies, and the quiet restoration of truth. At her garden gate, she paused to admire the roses in the last glow of the day. Their petals were flawless, their scent sweet, yet each stem bore its thorns. She thought of how often life resembled that very image beauty intertwined with danger, innocence shadowed by cruelty. And yet both were part of the same plant, inseparable. Miss Marple entered her cottage, set her hat neatly on its peg, and placed her gloves on the table. She lit her lamp, casting a warm glow across the familiar room, and settled once more into her chair. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click-click filling the silence. For those in the village, the case of the hollow valise would one day fade into a story told to new generations, embellished with each retelling. But for Miss Marple, it was another reminder of the simple truth she had always known, that the greatest mysteries were not those of foreign lands or distant crimes, but the quiet dramas of human hearts played out in every village and every home. She did not need recognition, nor thanks. It was enough to have seen clearly, to have lifted the veil of deception and set the truth quietly in its place. Tomorrow would bring fresh gossip, new little scandals, and perhaps a new puzzle of human behavior to consider. And so the curtain fell on the affair of the hollow valise, leaving Miss Marple exactly where she belonged, seated in her chair, needles in hand, her eyes keenly observing the small world around her, where every smile and silence held a story waiting to be told.